and welcome to the CX Files podcast. I'm your host, Mark Hillary. Scott Newman is the founder and CEO of Transparent BPO. He's based in Maryland in the USA, and the company has delivery services in Belize and the Philippines, as well as in the US. I wanted to talk to Scott about the process of transitioning a BPO into a distributed work-from-home company, as his company had to do during 2020. We talked about how his company managed this process and his thoughts on this emergency response now becoming permanent. We also talked about several related topics, including the new normal for 2021 and the possible resurgence of multi-sourcing. Right, Scott. So when this crisis started this year, every BPO all over the world, they quickly had to send their agents home. And one of the biggest concerns this caused for the clients was around security. I've talked recently to companies like ThinScale on this podcast, and they're focused entirely on work from home security. But how did you manage the process of suddenly creating a secure work from home environment? And I know you guys are in Belize, so were there any particular challenges down there?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Mark. Great to join you today too. And I do know ThinScale is a product as well, and I'm very impressed with the software. Something that we're actually looking at internally right now of onboarding into our environment. I think like any company, COVID-19 threw us all for a loop, especially the ones that were 100% brick and mortar like ourselves. And we are in the Philippines, in Belize, and then in the United States as well. I really think that, talking to others in the industry, there were really three main buckets of BPOs and how they handled the move from a work from home security standpoint. So the first bucket is really BPOs that have already supported work from home, and they already had Citrix or VMware, had some sort of scalable solution that they could deploy at home. But that's definitely the minority of BPOs that were out there. And then the second bucket are contact centers that were a little bit more brick and mortar based. And what they really did is they moved all the hardware from the office to home and basically said, how do we extend the office environment into the work from home scenario? And obviously that's very labor intensive, moving computers, monitors, keyboards, mice, and making sure all the software is working. And then the third bucket is these BPOs that did something non-compliant. There's no other way to really call it. And, for us, at Transparent BPO, we fell into the second bucket. So, with very little notice, we actually accomplished the work from home move in about a week and a half from the first day we started moving computers home. But we actually moved all of our hardware to home because we knew we had full control over the PC itself, since we could manage all the settings on it. We required all of our agents to VPN into our network. So we were essentially extending our office network to our agents' home. Really the biggest obstacle for most BPOs, and including ourselves, is the idea of physical security in a home environment. And I think that is the one that is BPOs. We're looking at short-term fixes and then trying to look at more long-term fixes that will satisfy that on an ongoing basis. And I guess that really depends on your outlook on the current situation and whether you think work from home is going to be a temporary thing and you're waiting to get back to the office, or whether you think work from home is going to be more of a standard thing. But we were able to accomplish it in about a week and a half. Many challenges in other countries. If you'd asked me in January of this year whether I thought work from home in Belize or the Philippines would really be possible, I probably would have said no. We've been very pleasantly surprised with the transition and how it's gone. The stability has been extremely good, but there were also challenges that we didn't anticipate. Little things like internet cords getting from routers, which in Belize are mounted on ceilings, not on like routers on like you put on your desk. So things like that were items that we overcame, but it was certainly a little bit different than we had expected.
Yeah, that's interesting, because I think that was sort of like the next point that I was going to ask you about is how permanent do we see this? The analyst community is talking about this new normal and work from home being a permanent ongoing part of the delivery model now. So, are your security and workforce management plans kind of accepting that this might be for the long term now?
Yeah, it's funny. We call it the new normal. I think at some point it's just going to be the normal, at least from our standpoint. And I joke all the time. I've worked from home for 12 years now, and so this is a very familiar situation to me, as many others. But our philosophy, we think this is work from home is going to be a requirement going forward. So the way that our outlook on this and how we're tackling it is we've actually moved our entire organization to a hub and spoke model. The basics of it are pretty simple, and it's not unique to us, but that we will have physical brick and mortar sites in very strategic locations in all of the countries that we operate in, and then deploy work from home around that hub. And it allows us for much more flexible deployments because we think that work from home is going to be a requirement in all markets. It's interesting to see what's happening right now in the U.S. market, where we're starting to see spikes of COVID again that are worse than they were back in April, May, in June when things were really taking off. And so I think this is going to be part of the process that we're going to have to deal with for quite some time. I think now it really in our industry is the time for innovation. And I've talked to a number of BPOs that I don't know how to say it other than they're sitting on the sidelines kind of saying, oh, we're at 10% capacity on brick or mortar. And when this passes, we're going to be fine. We're going to get back into the office. And so they're not making the investments right now, or they're not innovating to try to figure out work from home security for the long term. I think they're going to be in a world of hurt here in the next 6 months when they realize that clients have already come up with their long-term strategies. Clients have not been waiting to see what's happened. They've already looked at DRP plans and how they can, business continuity and how they're going to diversify across their markets. And from what we're hearing, work from home is going to be a standard for many, many, many years to come. It's going to be a requirement.
Yeah, and I find it really interesting that this hasn't been tackled earlier. Stephen Loynes, the analyst at TrendSal, he's been writing about this for at least 15 years. So why didn't the bigger BPO players in this industry already have like secure work from home solutions, or did they have this? It's just that it took a pandemic for the clients to get on board.
Actually, to your second point, there's a quote that we referenced internally, which is, it's by Ira Glass, but people are generally forced to change. We don't want to change, and then something absolutely forces us to realize that what we're doing isn't going to work and that our picture of the world is wrong. We fail, so we change. And I really think that that's how this situation got approached, is that, there clearly was work from home prior to this. Now, even Transparent BPO, we never wanted to really look at work from home because I think looking at the BPO industry overall, our industry is historically slow to respond and change. There are processes and systems that have been in place for decades that our industry has not caught up with and changed. And again, like historically speaking, there were two major operating models. You were either work from home or you were brick and mortar, but they were vastly different. And either you were an expert in work from home or you're an expert in brick and mortar, but to span the two, you were never really good at both. West and Live Ops back in the day, right? Those were the major players in the work from home space. And you couldn't really do both well. But I think with the advancements in call center technology and home internet being more accessible than ever in all countries in the world right now, even the price of home computers, laptops, tablets have gone down substantially to make them more affordable for our employees. I think the barriers between brick and mortar and work from home have been broken down over the last 5 or 6 years, but we've been slow as an industry to respond to that and look at ways to bridge the gap and say we should be offering both. And in terms of the work from home security that was existing, it's one of those things where it's kind of out of sight, out of mind. And unless there is a forced reason to change, the big players that were doing it weren't making substantial investments into it. Multi-factor authentication, the bare bones minimum of what was required. There's a concept we talk about all the time. It's being PCI compliant, and then also having the concept of continuous compliant. The reality is that a contact center that has work from home could be non-compliant for 364 days out of the year. We do site visits and we do work from home checks, but as long as that one day out of the year, when they get audited for PCI, that they pass because there's a clean desk environment or whatever the check is that they're doing, then they get PCI certification. It's kind of a false sense of comfort. And really what I think the pandemic has forced everybody to look at from a work from home situation, not just being able to support it more ongoing and have a seamless employee experience between brick and mortar and work from home, but the idea now is, how do we step up our security and work from home? And it's requiring people to change, look at it more carefully, and say, how do we make this better?
Yeah, and I mean, it's interesting you said there about it's both the security infrastructure, but even just the broadband infrastructure. I mean, do you think that if this pandemic happened a decade ago, you could have easily switched in Philippines and Belize?
No, I really don't. Just using Belize as an example, I've been operating in Belize for 11 years now. When I first entered the market, um, they prohibited VoIP connections. They literally had a team of people sitting in a room, and were looking for different software applications that were using VoIP and blocking it off of their network. They just didn't allow VoIP. And so if you just think about that as the starting point, 11 years ago, right, in Belize, to where we are now, where there are no such thing as a VoIP, block, or everybody gets a VoIP exemption. They're doing more contact center. The BPO space is growing. It's come a long way in 11 years, just in Belize alone. They actually just 4 years ago redid their fiber infrastructure in the entire country. And there is actually now fiber going to homes, which didn't exist before. So I think that the investments that countries like Belize have been making into their technology backbone have been critical to support something like this, and that the timing was actually in our favor, in a sense, when the pandemic came around, just because of having those investments already made.
Yeah, and there's plenty of places in what we would consider the developed environment. The US, Europe. I've certainly been reading a lot about where I come from in the UK, and there's entire towns where people can't work from home because they can only get 1 meg. So it's difficult in lots of places.
And not only that, when you start looking at a place like the Philippines as an example, and I think this is where so a global leader in that market, right? And then they've had challenges with the work from home infrastructure. It's all based around the metro area, so that there has been some investments made in the metro areas for stability and infrastructure. But as you start, getting further out of those metro areas, it gets pretty sticky. And I think that what the pandemic will do ultimately is to force countries like that and infrastructure providers to start looking at how they extend the backbone of their networks further out into the more non-metro areas.
Yeah, effectively, the internet backbone will be like the railroads a century or so ago, enabling people to travel into towns for work.
That's a great analogy. Absolutely.
I was on a webinar recently with Peter Ryan, the analyst from Canada, who co-hosts this podcast. And Peter was talking about multisourcing and the possible resurgence of multisourcing in CX and BPO. And I thought that was an interesting point because, we heard people like Gartner talking about this about 5 years ago, and it never really sort of went anywhere because people found it difficult managing multiple BPO providers. But now it seems that with this forced use of work from home, there's an argument that big clients should be having like a core CX partner, maybe one of the big guys, but then they should build resilience and flexibility by working with some smaller, more agile players. And it seems that sort of plays into what you're doing as well. So, have you heard similar people talking about this?
Oh, absolutely. Major players in the hospitality space have already adopted that deployment structure. But this was happening well before the pandemic. I think that as clients reevaluate post-pandemic, it'll be for different reasons. But I think specifically around multi-sourcing, there was probably 6-7 years ago in our market where clients were looking for cost savings, right? And that was the only driver. They were going, from domestic work, moving everything to the Philippines, to India, other places, strictly as a cost savings maneuver. But part of that was we have to trim back some of our support staff in the United States as well, not just the agents, but the support staff. And so in order to facilitate that, because there was such a tremendous cost crunch, they were almost forced to go with one vendor because they wanted one master contract and one throat to choke and not have to worry about managing multiple partners. But what happened over that time is there was complacency that took place and a lack of innovation because there was no challengers. There was no champion challenger model that was set up. And so what happened was that the customer's experience was ultimately the one that suffered. And with social media, booming, and one upset customer can cause irreparable harm to your brand by going onto the internet. I think that they've realized that it's not just about cost savings. And now we've seen, over the last 5 or 6 years, companies run back to onshore, nearshore. And I think that where they're now looking at is saying, we should be making that investment into vendor managers and that support personnel internally so that we can go out and test different providers and be a little bit more provider agnostic, because you get something different. Every provider brings something different to the table. They have their own core competencies and they can provide value. And I think, again, champion challenger models are healthy when they're done correctly. I think that what the trend that we have been seeing is that more vendors are doing champion challenger models, but they're also encouraging communication and participation between the vendors, where 4 or 5 years ago it was, no, we're not going to talk to this other vendor because they're our competition. And now there's more knowledge sharing and we're working as groups. Even though we're competing for seats, but we're working as groups to grow the business as a whole and take care of our client. That's really the trend that was happening before COVID, and I think will continue into the future.
Yeah, it certainly looks like that's being accelerated. And if you were talking to a potential client who was exploring that kind of champion challenger model, then what would you be suggesting that as a smaller player compared to a TP or Sykes, what do you bring into the table then?
I mean, I think I get asked that question often, and I think the best way for me to answer this is kind of tell you about the core DNA of a smaller BPO and where our priorities lie. Because I think fundamentally that's where the difference lies. So, if I could explain just a little, like in our industry, it's cyclical in terms of market consolidation in the BPO space, right? Every 5 or so years, the larger players come in, they go into acquisition mode, they gobble up a lot of the small and middle-sized players. The industry was in that phase in 2009 when I started Transparent BPO with my partners. And I think the market started to see that again pre-COVID. We started seeing more of that consolidation happen. And that happens every 4 or 5 years. But let's look at what happens when these acquisitions happen. Let's look at some of the major acquisitions that happened over the last 10 or 15 years. You get 2 or 3 companies that are big players that are trying to come together. They all have separate software systems, separate infrastructure, separate philosophies about how they go about doing business, separate cultures, separate management teams. And these BPOs rarely have figured out how to integrate these multiple acquisitions into one seamless model. And you end up with a Frankenstein acquisition. It never integrates into one brand. And so what happens is that the employees' experience suffers, which then, as we know, translates to customer experiences suffering. And it really, at the back of this, it's because these acquisitions are driven for financial reasons solely, right? I want to be the biggest player. I want to, gain the most market share. In smaller BPOs, like in our board, we have a philosophy. We say acquisition is not a strategy, right? Which means that we're not just going to grow by acquiring for the sake of growth. We have to grow for something strategic to fill a void. Is it a talent acquisition? Is it a client or a logo? Or is it getting into a market that it'd be tough to open in organically? And I know that's a really long answer to your question about what the difference is between, a large BPO and a small one, but I really feel like it comes from the DNA of a small BPO. We started the business because in many of our smaller BPO cohorts, we started them because we wanted to fix a problem. Like we felt like customer service was being done poorly, or we wanted to make an impact on a smaller market, perhaps, make an impact in our world. Maybe the entrepreneurial spirit of just wanting to provide for their family, right? The motivations to start these smaller players that grow into mid-sized players are very different. That's our DNA. It's the entrepreneurial spirit. Every single one of our interactions are important because our brand and our reputation are the reason that we do business. Our motivations are not financially driven. We're not reporting to shareholders. It isn't, trying to run razor thin margins. We're trying to provide for our families. And I think that's really at the core is the major difference between the big tier 1 players and the small to mid-sized BPOs. our interactions with our clients and their customers are far more critical and important to our success. And so they get more of our time, they get more of our innovation, and they get more of our consultative approach to doing business. We care about our culture, and our motivations are trying to create something special, not just trying to pad, shareholder pockets.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I'd much rather have a long answer rather than, a slogan from a PowerPoint deck or something like that. Look, we're in November 2020 now. We're counting down the weeks to the end of the year. So, just to close this out, finally then, are you looking at any particular trends or changes that might move us beyond the COVID crisis of this year? What are you expecting next year?
Yeah, it's going to be an interesting year to come, to say the least. We can't use the excuse of we didn't know. Well, who knew COVID was going to happen this year? It's here. And so it's going to be an interesting year to see what happens. A lot of it is kind of a wait and see. We're interested to see what's going to happen over the next 6 months. I know clients have already kind of made their strategies, but how that will actually play out with COVID and whether the United States specifically can get it under control and whether a vaccine comes out. There's a lot of unknowns at this stage, but I think 3 major trends that we kind of are keeping our eye on is that I think number one is that you have to have best-in-class security around work from home, right? So for us, we're innovating and creating products that will ensure that we have best-in-class work from home, looking at products like ThinScale, as well as building proprietary products. So I think innovative around security for work from home is going to be a requirement because clients are going to be looking for that. The tech center-based things. I think most companies that are reputable and have navigated this situation well have security, physical and data under control at this point in a work from home scenario. But for a lot of companies like ourselves, we were only brick and mortar. Now how do we replicate the employee experience from the office to home? That's the next logical transition. How do we create a seamless experience for our employees? So I think technology is going to get real big in terms of communication and employee experience, not necessarily customer facing quite yet. I think it's really about how do we make sure that we're able to effectively manage, look at performance, create a nice environment in a work from home. So I think looking at investments around that is going to be another big trend. And then the last one is client behavior. I think clients have not forgotten who got sidelined during COVID and whose customer bases weren't able to get served because BPOs weren't able to make the transition in a COVID situation. I think in early 2021, we're going to see a number of clients come back into the market, looking at RFPs and new providers, looking at different strategies, really evaluating a work from home scenario of how that will work. And I think that for the first time ever, they're going to be looking at nearshore and offshore locations. Part of the RFP process will be evaluating these markets for home internet stability and, how accessible these types of things are and how the BPO provider is able to support a really flexible deployment model, being able to be work from home one day and brick and mortar the next to handle natural disasters or the ongoing pandemic. So I think a lot of the typical BPO destinations that you've seen over the last 5 or 10 years that have a stronghold on the market and represent a lot of the labor market, I think are going to go through quite a transition, and clients are probably going to diversify a lot more than they ever have.
Thanks for downloading the CX Files podcast. If you have a moment, please give us a star rating or review on your favorite podcast provider because this really helps other people to find the podcast. If you have any suggestions for future guests or ideas, people or topics, then please just find myself, Mark Hillary, or Peter Ryan on LinkedIn and send a suggestion.